Well, hello everybody, and welcome to another edition of WHAP with your buddy, your friend, Mr. Jones. And in this video, I'm going to be covering Unit 6, Topic 5. And it's kind of springboarding off of everything we've been looking at up until this point. And today we're going to focus on economic imperialism. Remember, once again, imperialism is when one country dominates another politically, economically, and socially. So let's take a look at where we are, and then we will get back into our lesson. So, economic imperialism. So this is going to be a little bit about money today. Actually, it should be a lot about money. And here's our context that we're working with, and that is that Great Britain pushes India out of the finished textile market. India only creates raw cotton to be sold to British factories, with finished goods being sold back to them at inflated prices. We talked a little about this in the previous video, and today we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail. Great Britain enters the Chinese market selling opium. So we're going to look at that in detail as well, the Opium War. So our essential question in this particular video is, what economic factors contributed to imperialism in the global economy between 1750 and 1900? So, that being said, let's get right into it and let's look at our context. This is a good time to stop the video if you need to take notes in your Unit 6 packet. But our context today is that we know that the Industrial Revolution creates a need for raw goods. We looked at that in detail in Unit 5. Technological ability like steamships, railroads, and military weapons also allowed industrial nations to control other territories. Notice control is written there in bold print. Here's a definition for economic imperialism. Foreign business interests have economic power of influence over natural resources beyond their borders. And in doing so, this is going to involve the exploitation of laborers, the fleecing, if you will, of raw materials, as well as some minerals. Export economies. These are colonial states, these are colonies now, okay, that produce goods not for sale at home, but to be sent to colonial powers and then sold for profit. We see this happening in the American Revolution. This is one of the things that'll precipitate the Boston Tea Party that you learned about in 8th grade. So this focuses on cash crops and raw materials, and this is some things that we've teetered on a little bit when we've taught about this in earlier videos. Economic imperialism, just to bring it home, let's go to Hawaii. And Hawaii is known for really one product and one product only, and that is sugar. American sugar planters and businessmen went to Hawaii in 1892 hoping to overthrow the monarchy that was going on in Hawaii, led by Queen Liliuokalani. And without so much as a declared war, what we're seeing is that Hawaii is simply annexed by the United States, just like that. And the word annex means simply to add to what you already have. In 1898, Hawaii becomes a territory of the U.S., and in 1959, along with Alaska, it will become our 50th and so far the last state admitted into the Union. Here is the queen right here. I was talking about Liliuokalani. That's just a fun name to say. It really is. So this is kind of how the United States, we actually are better at economic imperialism than we are at any other forms of imperialism. That's why this Unit 6-5 is such an important topic to look at. So moving right along, let's look now in Europe, our context now being England. In 1588, England defeats the Spanish Armada. That was the best navy in the world, which allows the British and the Dutch to talk over the Asian spice trade from the Spanish and the Portuguese. Remember, the Spanish and the Portuguese, their influence has waned greatly during this new industrial/economic revolution. Let's break it down even further. India. By 1600, we know that the British East India Company was formed to take part in the spice trade. And as I mentioned several videos ago, the East India Company was really the governing factor of India for a long, long time. Here's the problem, though. They run into competition. They start stepping on each other's toes, running into competition from the Dutch. And what we're going to see throughout this transition is that they will abandon spices to focus on cotton and silk textiles. The bigger money is obviously in cotton. And by the late 1700s, the British East India Company will dominate the global textile trade. Now, the weavers in India will continue to weave European-style textiles. So what India is going to end up doing is that they're going to provide mostly raw cotton to Britain in order to be finished in Britain in the textile mills there and then sold to the public. So this is how economic imperialism works. It's one of our earliest examples that we have of this. Meanwhile, in Indonesia, remember that's also known as the Dutch East Indies at this time, we have the Dutch East India Company. You might see it abbreviated as the VOC. They will monopolize trade with Indonesia and the Spice Islands, not far away from there. Now, the Dutch East India Company is very bankrupt and corrupt. By 1799, the Dutch government is going to take control of Indonesia, hence being called the Dutch East Indies. And they will develop something called a culture system. This is one of the things that signifies their corruption, where they force farmers to set aside 1/5 of land for cash crop farming or work 66 days in the field for free. That's known as corvée labor. It's required and it's unpaid work. You might know it by a different name, slavery. That's basically what they were guilty of, and yet they're going to call it this unusual term of corvée labor. So anyway, that's this slide. So in the next one, let's now talk about opium. Chinese goods like silk, tea, and porcelain were in high demand in Britain, but China did not import finished goods from Britain, which creates a trade imbalance. So Britain, in order to fill the gap, starts trading opium, which is a powerful and highly addictive narcotic. It was used during the Victorian era to treat pain as a pain medication. It was commonly prescribed by doctors for gout. Well, I say prescribed, there was no such thing as prescriptions, but doctors would ordinarily give that for gout. And most of that would be done in liquid form, and about a drop of opium would be enough to cure the pain for a long time. But it becomes highly addictive, and it is highly regressive once you are addicted to it. It's very, very tragic. You know, we're talking about the opioid epidemic in the United States today, and really in the world. You see the word opioid. It's that kind of drug. So anything, if you've ever taken for pain medicine, remember, if you have prescriptions for that stuff and you don't use it, it's best to flush it down the toilet. That's how nasty this stuff can be. So nasty, in fact, that in 1839 to 1842, they fought the first Opium War, where China decides to criminalize opium and sets up a blockade, and they go to war around it. Now, China was shocked at how much power the industrialized nation had concerning this. They showed the world that industrial powers would be able to dominate non-industrial ones. Okay? The Treaty of Nanking, which was probably one of the most lopsided treaties ever written, requires China to open 4 ports, give the territory of Hong Kong to the British, which they will control all the way up until the end of the 20th century. And that, of course, gives them the control of opium. And let me just move my screen here so y'all can see that. But that is a good example of economic imperialism. They used an addictive narcotic to kind of cement their role as an economic powerhouse. Not good enough. There's a second opium war where Britain and China are unhappy with the first treaty, and Britain really wanted opium to be legal. By this time, it's really become an important thing for them. How many of y'all like Charles Dickens novels? Probably not many of you. But in a lot of Charles Dickens novels, he writes about how people are often addicted to opium. In his final novel that he wrote, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, there is some opium usage in there. It was very, very common in Victorian England. And it just kind of led to one of the reasons why that was such a degrading society at that time. France joins Britain in this second opium war because France would like to have it legal as well. The second treaty, the Treaty of Tientsin, allows foreigners to live in Beijing, opens new ports to the west, and it allows free movement of Christian missionaries. It legalized opium. It's almost like that's in there as a rider, right? We're doing all this neat stuff. Oh, but we're going to legalize opium. And gave Great Britain more land. This is going to lead to China's decline, and it will increase the influence of both Britain and France in China. So in a way, China will now become a sphere of influence. And I think we've talked about this before. It's one of the forms of imperialism. A sphere of influence. Because China is weak, Japan, France, Germany, Russia, and the US forced China to give them spheres of exclusive trade, okay? And what that means is that they now control the economic future of China at that time. So what the U.S. will start is something called an open door policy. And what this is defined as is that the U.S. basically says that trade in China should be open to all countries equally to prevent someone from dominating China. In other words, many people should be allowed to pick the pocket of another country instead of just one, because that wouldn't be fair. And yes, that would include their opium as well. Probably the best example of economic imperialism that we have during this time is what you're seeing on this slide, which I will now stand out of the way for so you can see it. Let's jump over to Africa now. Africa is mostly agricultural, but it converted to a cash crop production to meet European needs. And Africa, just like they have been, has always been reliant upon imperial powers. The reliance on cash crops will leave Africans vulnerable during the drought or the economic decline. We're seeing food production go down, which causes prices to go up. That's basic economics. Most good land was devoted to cash crop growing. Speaking of cotton, though, since we mentioned it earlier, in Kenya, Sudan, and Egypt, that makes up about 93% of their entire imports, okay? And it will soon replace people and ivory as the chief African export. We often don't think about that, but I have a feeling that in the DBQ that you'll be taking for the AP exam, if it asks a question about that, you don't want to miss that these parts of Africa were main cotton exporters there and getting away from some of the other things we're used to seeing come out of East Africa. So let me break it down again. Kenya, groups like the Kikuyu were forced off of the land for white farmers to grow cash crops. And of course, they moved to land that was a little less arable, and they weren't allowed to grow cash crops, if they could grow anything at all. On the Gold Coast there in West Africa, cocoa, whatever. That's a major cash crop, and the Gold Coast will become the largest exporter of that. And for those of y'all like chocolate, you know exactly what this is. West Africa is still in the palm oil and peanut business, just like they were in the previous video we looked at. As far as slaves go, it was banned in the British colonies in 1833, but it will persist elsewhere. The French colonies practice slavery, and slaves are used to produce cash crops. This is no big secret, right? Some companies stopped buying African goods produced by slaves, like Cadbury. And I'm going to let you look that up in just a minute. So there you have, this is basically Africa, and I'll stop right here so you can take notes for your Unit 6 packet. And now we're going to move on to Latin America. Britain replaces Spain as the largest investor in Latin America. We learned about this in a previous video. $10 billion between 1870 and 1919. And Latin America was imperialized by both the British and the United States. Let's be honest, the Second Industrial Revolution makes the United States rich beyond their wildest dreams. And most of the foreign investments, they weren't in Africa or a place like that. They were in Latin America, Mexico, and Cuba, two biggest ones for the United States. They support railroads and infrastructure, as most imperial powers did at that time. They mined guano and meat. Remember in one video I asked you to look up guano? That was really a crappy thing to sell. Haha, there's my joke. And in 1823, we had the Monroe Doctrine, and just to refresh your memory, that was the thing issued by President Monroe saying that the Western Hemisphere is closed to outside influence, period. It's now under the protection, if you will, of the United States. Britain, on the other hand, goes further south. They will invest in Argentina, more in Argentina than India. So this is another fact that a lot of people don't think about. But yes, Argentina makes, Argentina becomes the richest country in Latin America because of British involvement. And it helps with famine, not farming, I should say famine, building railroads and telegraphs and new ports. So the British colonizing Argentina ended up working out well for the Argentinians. Unfortunately, there is still a territory today outside of Argentina, the Falkland Islands, which, the British and the Argentinians fought a war over that island in 1982. That's, of course, for a later unit, which we obviously don't need to cover this year. But Moving on into western part of Latin America, mining in Chile. Chile is that long, thin country on the western coast of Latin America. And agricultural imports and the mining of copper made Chile completely dependent on its trade relationships with Spain. You remember what a big product rubber was. The booming industry declines after cheaper rubber is made in Malaysia. And y'all remember where Malaysia was, right? It illustrates how trade always benefits the industrialized nation, and trade power is always fragile. So rubber becomes a big cash crop in Brazil. As far as Central America and the Caribbean, the United Fruit Company. This is something you'll learn about in U.S. history, hopefully, if you get to that point. That the United Fruit Company, it sounds like a friendly organization, sounds like something you'd want to invest in. No, it is an economic imperialist organization. They work with the U.S. and Latin American governments to keep trade profitable for the company, because this is all about capitalism, let's not forget. You might see in your readings banana republics. Let me define what that means. These are small countries under the economic power of foreign-based corporations. That should be small Latin American countries, not whatever the C stands for. And they're politically unstable with an economy dependent on the export of just one or two limited goods. So I think that's pretty interesting right there. So just know what banana republics are. So hopefully in this video you've gotten a really good definition of economic imperialism, and I've given you enough examples of that. But just for your own enrichment, watch Steve Heimler's video on this very topic. The link is right up here. I think it's right there. You see it? You can click on that now. And I'll see you back for Unit 6.6. We're going to look at the causes of migration in our next video. I hope you're doing well. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you next time.